welcome back to week 6 of Ethics and Archaeology. This is our last week. Wild. I don't really know how we got there to this point, but we are here, so welcome. I just wanted to thank you all for your comments on last week's video. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts about everything, and I'm looking forward to seeing some good discussion following this one and hopefully about the other topics that we've touched on as well. So let's get into some politics. Obviously, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about kind of fit with other things that we've discussed because everything kind of comes full circle when you're talking about ethical debates. So forgive me for that, but hopefully there'll be some really interesting stuff in here nonetheless. So first we're going to talk about the different uses of archaeology for political purposes, I guess, both in upholding dominant narratives and subverting those things as well. And what that kind of looks like, some examples, why these things might be positive or negative or neutral or whatever. We're then going to talk about some difficulties in exploring the topic of politics, and some kind of external forces which apply onto archaeology which make it even more challenging, such as funding, corruption, and conflict, which are obviously all challenging things in and of themselves. Like, this isn't specific to archaeology, but obviously we're going to talk about it in an archaeological context. And then we're going to finish up by consolidating our knowledge and trying to link everything we speak about in this lecture to everything we've spoken about so far, because last week, that's so strange. Anyway, let's get into it. So, the first thing to note is that upholding narratives isn't necessarily a bad thing, even though what I'm going to talk about tends to be the more extreme versions of that. Upholding narratives is basically just confirming what we think is true based on the archaeological evidence, providing more evidence for things that we already believe. Which can obviously be a good thing, to kind of support our perspectives and our knowledge, and especially when doing interdisciplinary kind of research, exploring how things like literature or whatever else kind of ties into archaeology, and they can strengthen each other. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. What can be kind of challenging or difficult sometimes is when archaeology is used to support narratives which aim to kind of dismantle and oppress other people and other people's ideas. So, for example, this can often be through nationalism and nationalist discourse. So the first example we see really of this is antiquarianism that's a mouthful, in Greece in the 19th century, which kind of prioritized the study of the past and the study of archaeological Greece, of Athens and Sparta and, the Peloponnesian War and everything and anything to support the narrative of the past, and to kind of draw on this notion of modern Greece as being descendant from ancient Greece, and the power and the legitimacy that provides. Most of the time when when archaeology is kind of used in a nationalist way, it's to kind of give legitimacy to the nation state or to the ruler or something like that, which can be, good, I guess, in some instances where that is how the community feels, but it can also be a little destructive. For example, Mussolini's Italy in the early 20th century, essentially what he tried to do was to use the notion of collective memory to strengthen his legitimacy as the ruler. We see him as a dictator now, but anyway, that's kind of beside the point. Mussolini really wanted to draw on Rome as modern Italy's predecessor, and use the history and the narratives established in Rome about Rome, like how Romans saw themselves in terms of like creation myths and gods and whatever, to kind of strengthen the narrative of Italy as a descendant of Rome. which in theory is fine. You know, every single community has some kind of myth behind it to kind of create this imagined community and to strengthen the ties between each other. But where it does become difficult is when it applies to physical remains and destruction. So essentially what Mussolini did, especially in the city of Rome itself, was to destroy a lot of archaeological evidence which post-dated the Roman period. This meant a lot of people's homes and a lot of religious and important cultural buildings which came after the Romans. You can imagine that there was a lot were destroyed in his pursuit to highlight the cultural heritage of the Roman period in Rome. So, for example, I think it's on the first slide. Yeah, so this is the mausoleum of Augustus. I think this photo was taken after World War II, so like it didn't look like that when Mussolini was trying to present it in a certain way, but essentially what he did was to clear all around it, which had a lot of people's houses like backed onto the mausoleum, clean it all out, present it in a certain way, and then he went further than that and destroyed a bunch of houses and remains to create roads that linked important political and historical buildings like the Colosseum with a bunch of other buildings to kind of create this vision of Rome as, you know, his political centers and the historical things as just being intrinsically connected. So that's why Rome kind of looks the way it does, why the ruins are still preserved and why they've been cleared out and stuff like that. Whereas in other places it doesn't always look like that. Ancient remains kind of get absorbed into what it looks like in the modern day. So, obviously Mussolini was trying to portray a very particular narrative using archaeology, is the point I was trying to make with that entire spiel. Moving on. Saddam Hussein in Iraq and his use of Babylon kind of follows a similar narrative to Mussolini, except it's a little bit more specific because apparently he was very obsessed with Nebuchadnezzar, who is like a Babylonian king, to the point that he built this, I'm pointing to the top image on your slide, this wonderful, now abandoned palace on top of the remains of Babylon as a kind of reconstruction that also sought to legitimize his rule. So like within the facade of it there's a whole bunch of Arabic characters, there's a whole bunch of bricks which proclaim that Saddam Hussein himself is descendant from Nebuchadnezzar. And yeah, he really sought to do all this to kind of point out his own legitimacy, obviously, but also to highlight Iraq's exceptionalism, which I put here. Not that Iraq's not exceptional, don't get me wrong, I have studied a lot of it, it is, but yeah, it was more of a political device when he was using it in this specific form. Moving on from things specific to communities or specifically to nation-state communities, the role of international politics is quite complicated when considering archaeology. And the case study that I want to talk about today is actually Beirut. I planned to talk about this before last week happened with obviously the horrendous explosion. And I don't know, had a lot of difficulty deciding whether I wanted to still talk about this in light of what happened. And I think I still do. Obviously, I wouldn't be talking to you about this if I didn't. But yeah, I just wanted to flag that talking about historical Beirut is not to undermine or take away from the discussions which are happening now. Obviously, what happened last week was an absolutely horrendous and tragic loss of human life and homes, and you know, now what's happening with the protest is obviously very challenging for Lebanese citizens and the Lebanese diaspora, which Australia has a lot of, so I really empathise, and I don't want that this discussion to really take away from that. But I think Beirut is a really good discussion of how international politics and the pressures and the different perspectives can really influence archaeology. So let's get into it. Essentially, what is complicated about international politics is that when we're talking about the national or the nation state kind of thoughts about things, as we have already done, is often quite contrasted with external or international thoughts on a thing. So, for example, the concept of World Heritage, as in UNESCO, the World Heritage Site, or even just the notion that you can feel connected to something even if you've never lived there or you've never seen it. Like, I feel quite connected to, the Giza pyramids, but I've never been there, and I'm really not Egyptian in any way, state, or form. But nonetheless, I feel like it forms part of human history, and as a human, it makes me feel connected to it, which I think a lot of people can empathise with. I don't think you would be here having this class if you didn't believe that in, any capacity, but obviously that becomes complicated when a smaller community who has more control over that territory has a different perspective. So, for example, Beirut in 1995 just got out of, a decade, 15 years, I think, 15 years, not a decade, sorry, of civil war. The capital of the country, Lebanon, was, quite destroyed, especially the old town where a lot of the archaeological remains were and still are. So this bottom site is an image of Beirut after the Civil War, when reconstructions were about to be had, but because of the laws that were in place at the time, there needed to be archaeological investigation before things were built on top. Quite complicated, because the laws were written in the 30s under different rule and different influences and stuff like that, and probably weren't acceptable enough, or weren't in a position to really apply to such a huge grand scale as the entire old town. You should look it up. It's a humongous area, which unfortunately now really correlates to the zone of destruction at the moment. Anyway, so yes, Civil War. People want to start reconstructing their capital and the city, and you can see in the image, there are still buildings standing. But to do that, to make those reconstructions, you had to have archaeology first. And essentially, this was a humongous job, which could have taken, 2 centuries to do, but obviously they did not have that, because you need your capital city to be functioning, especially the core of it. So, very quick job. I know people who worked on it. Apparently they were excavating with, bulldozers and stuff like that, which happens quite a lot in commercial archaeology, as someone who's worked in commercial archaeology, but the remains are not usually as rich and as long-standing as this. In the old town, there was remains which dated back to at least the Bronze Age, and probably before that. So it's very different to, the approach to research archaeology. It was essentially trying to apply like a commercial archaeology lens to a humongous research archaeology site. Difficult, very, very difficult. And essentially what happened was, stuff inevitably got lost, heritage destroyed forever, and the difficulty of this comes from the fact that the developers really just pushed and pushed and pushed, whereas, and that came from the government as well. You can talk about corruption if you want. That's obviously something that has been highlighted in the last couple of weeks, tragically. But also, you had this kind of internal pressure to like get it done, to get reconstructed, to start life again, to, do all these really important things. But also you had the external pressure from this World Heritage perspective, which said like, why are you going so fast? What are you doing? And UNESCO copped a lot of shit for it. if I do say so myself. I'm just reading and hearing about it anyway. So, yeah, essentially you can uphold narratives with archaeology, but it's difficult and it's complicated, and any kind of story that you perpetuate usually forgets different voices, and that's where subversion comes into it. Archaeology can obviously be used for strengthening things we already think, but it can also be used to ensure visibility for minority perspectives, and making sure that a range of different perspectives are able to be interpreted at the same time. That's called multivocality, and we've spoken about it, but I'll talk about it any day because I love Ian Hodder. Anyway, so these are the Cahokia mounds in the continental US of A. I know some of you are from the US, so if you have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear it. But essentially, I wanted to include this because it has an amazing reconstruction. Essentially, early thoughts about these mounds were that, it couldn't have possibly been the First Nations American people who built them. It must have been another group who came in and then left or died or something like that. No, that's wrong. That's very untrue. As far as I know, and you see a very similar kind of narrative in Australia as well, with a whole bunch of our Indigenous cultural heritage just originally being attributed to other groups apart from the people that still lived there. Hugely untrue. But yeah, this is just to say that archaeology can serve a whole range of different purposes, and pursuing the truth is more important than pursuing specific narratives, and the truth includes a whole range of diverse opinions, as it should. The other thing is archaeological investigations can assist in providing access to information which people might not already have. And also kind of like legitimizing the knowledge that people do have. Not that it needs legitimizing by any stance, but a lot of people, like a lot of governments kind of struggle to listen to people, especially minority groups, when they express themselves. That's a problem in and of itself, but archaeology is, pretty handy in a political sense for kind of legitimizing, providing additional information and additional strength to arguments that shouldn't need extra strength, but also just like democratizing this knowledge and trying to make it more accessible to people. So, like certain stories which can be backed up and, supported visually like this by archaeology or whatever, to kind of contrast those dominant narratives. Subversion, yay. Why is this difficult? Oh, where to start? Alright, let's begin with funding. Funding is always political for everything and anything. For archaeology, it kind of either depends on what you expect to find. So a funding body might just analyse that and say like, nah, I don't really want anything to do with a certain narrative or whatever. Obviously it's not that overt, they give a whole bunch of excuses, but it's just this constant prioritization of specific knowledge systems and narratives, which tends to favour a dominant hierarchy rather than that subversive narrative kind of pursuit that we just discussed. So what you expect to find can be taken into account when funding is assessed. What projects say about your country or your community or your culture is obviously something that is taken into account as well. For example, when you're writing a research grant in Australia, you often try to promote this idea that it will help Australians be at the forefront of knowledge production, and be recognised for a thing, which is obviously something that at least national boards or specific community funding groups want. They want to be promoted. They want to feel like it's going to reflect well on them, essentially. It's all optics. That's the end. I should just end the PowerPoint right there. Like, optics, hello, done. But I'm not. I'm going to keep talking just for a little while. The other thing is that funding can lead to prioritization of certain manifestations of heritage. So, for example, the UNESCO World Heritage List, for a very long time, and still today, they're making more conscious efforts about it now, but it really prioritized like physical, religious, cultural sites in Europe. So there was like more churches on the list than anything else combined, I believe, for a time. Something like 800 churches listed as World Heritage, and then like natural landscapes, which are hugely important to a range of different groups, especially Indigenous groups. We're just like, nah, whatever. So they're doing better at that, but there's still a big problem with certain remains and certain important cultural kind of constructs being prioritized over others. And you guessed it, it tends to be Western understandings of what's an important landscape, or whatever, that tends to be prioritized, which is awesome. No, it's not. Another thing is that intangible culture is really hard to kind of prove, and I think that is a little bit less Western centric, at least on the heritage list. But yeah, funding is complicated, it's political. The other thing is corruption. Obviously makes everything really difficult. We've talked already about fakes and forgeries and how archaeologists can be complicit in that. Arms traders, antiquities traders. Oh boy. We've talked about all that. I'm not going to get into it already, but yeah, that's all difficult. The other thing that's difficult is that if you have a corrupt government, sometimes archaeologists don't get paid, or sometimes museums don't get enough funding, or whatever. So obviously that makes promoting and preserving archaeology and cultural heritage to be extremely difficult. And the other thing is that accusations of corruption, such as Zahir Hawass here, can be used to kind of stop people who are either whistleblowing or promoting a certain narrative. So Zahir Hawass has been very critical of the fact that there's a lot of Egyptian objects in non-Egyptian museums, and then after the revolution in 2011, he was forced to step down under allegations of corruption. I'm not here to defend that, I don't know enough about it, but he was a very prominent figure, and still does a lot of like public lectures and stuff like that, travels around, writes inflammatory things, things that I really like, but things that some people don't, about the nature of archaeology, and especially Egyptian archaeology, and that kind of global take on it. So corruption is obviously a bad thing. Wow, who knew? And obviously conflict as well. It's something I keep coming back to, and I'm sorry because I know these, these images and this discussion is not easy. It's certainly not easy for me, but as I've said before, I think the hardest things to talk about are the things that are the most important to talk about. So this is an image of the Bamiyan Buddhas, which were/are in Afghanistan. This was taken before they were blown up in 2001. Obviously there is a religious aspect to that, but there's also obviously a political and a dominant hierarchy narrative to that as well. Dominant hierarchy? Yeah, sure, but dominant narrative to that as well, in that the Taliban wanted to promote a certain narrative of Afghani heritage, and these did not fit into it, and therefore they were destroyed. I was going to put in a picture of ISIS's destruction instead, but I get really tired of talking about them, and they want attention. That's why they did what they did. So I don't want to give them that satisfaction. So yeah, obviously conflict is complicated. Political conflict, political instability, infighting, but then also violence and physical conflict that leads to the destruction or damage or, forgetting about artifacts and to take care of them even in times of conflict. It's obviously stuff that's very challenging for archaeology. So how does all this connect to the stuff that we've been talking about? We have covered a lot in our 6 weeks together, and I really want to thank you for being here and engaging with all these things. I know at times it's been really challenging, or maybe at times it's stuff you've already known, so thank you for sticking with me through this. I hope it's all made sense and I hope it's been interesting for you. So we've talked about all of this. We've talked about the origins of archaeology. I'm not going to say the magic words. The Grand Tour. No, we're not going there. Essentially colonialism, whitewashing Western-centric models and how that supported these notions of racial science and justified imperialism, and a whole bunch of stuff. And then also how archaeology wants to move away from these kind of roots. We've talked about the ownership of the past in terms of politics today, religion, the antiquities trade, physically owning things, whether things can be traded, what it means to own a piece of the past, repatriation, where these relics of the past should be and who has control over that. We've spoken about representation, both in the media and through politics, with strengthening minority voices, and yeah, like I said, moving forward, what archaeology, in my opinion, and hopefully yours, and hopefully other people as well, should look like, which is having a much more diverse, multivocal perspective, incorporating many more voices into our practice, post-colonialism, if that's possible, and then museums and their role in that, and whether they should be restructured, how, all ties in together. That's it. Oh my god. We're done. Except you're never really done, because these things are always discussed and always evolving, and I'm sure I could write an entirely different syllabus in like 2 years when so many more discourses and discussions have been had. But thank you. That's all I have to say. Thank you for being here. I hope you learned something. I've certainly learned stuff through talking about this and hearing myself talk, but mostly and most importantly through talking to you and hearing your thoughts and your very unique perspectives. So, yeah, thank you for being here. I wish you all the best with whatever you're doing now and in the future, and I hope some of this knowledge is helpful or useful to you moving forward. I'd love to hear about what you all are planning to do for the rest of the year, and yeah, have an excellent day, week, month, life, and hopefully we'll see each other soon. Bye.